When we talk about easy leagues, two examples almost always come up: Germany with Bayern Munich and France with PSG, and that makes sense. Bayern has won 12 of the last 13 Bundesliga titles, and PSG has won 11 of the last 13 Ligue 1 titles. After seeing the same clubs win over and over again, many people conclude that the French and German leagues are not competitive, lack suspense, and are almost decided in advance. But is that really the case? Because in reality, simply counting titles is not enough. A league can have few champions, but still offer a lot of suspense, and conversely, it can have several different champions without any real suspense. Take a simple example. If the same club wins the title 10 times, but only by 1 point each time, then the competition is intense, closely contested, and the league remains highly competitive. On the other hand, if different clubs win but with gaps of 20 or 30 points each time, then the seasons are often decided early, without tension, without real stakes, and therefore much less interesting to follow. In other words, debating based on impressions is not enough. To objectively judge a league's competitiveness, we need a real indicator, a numerical index capable of measuring dominance, gaps, and suspense. That is exactly what we are going to explore in this video, and the results may clearly be surprising. But first, here is the metric we are going to use: the League Competitiveness Index. This index was created by the English content creator Root Nunn, who designed a formula to measure the level of dominance within a league. And here is the formula. The goal is not to overwhelm you with mathematics, so to simplify, the index takes into account several key factors: the number of matches played in a league, the percentage of titles won by the dominant team over a given period, the points gap between first and second place, and the goal difference. The logic is straightforward. The higher the final score, the stronger and more repeated the dominance within the league, and the lower the score, the more balanced and competitive the league is. For this analysis, we looked at the last 10 seasons and applied the index to a wide selection of leagues around the world. However, some were excluded, particularly those using special formats or split phases such as MLS, Malta, or certain South American leagues like Argentina, for example. We also excluded leagues for which official data was insufficient to produce a reliable calculation. So now that we have the tool, let's see what it reveals when applied to the 5 major European leagues, and the result may surprise more than a few people. According to the index, the most competitive league among the Big 5 is La Liga, ahead of Serie A and the Premier League. At first glance, that may seem counterintuitive to some, because it often feels like Spain has been dominated by the same clubs for a decade, and that is true, but only on the surface. Remember, the index does not measure who wins, but how they win. In Spain, even if the same teams frequently win titles, the points gaps are generally small. The seasons are genuinely contested and often decided late. By contrast, some leagues perceived as highly competitive may have experienced stronger periods of dominance than people realize. In England, for example, Manchester City has won many recent titles, sometimes with significant points gaps. That mechanically raises the competitiveness index, and it becomes even clearer when looking at Germany and France. There, the numbers fully confirm the general impression. Over the last 10 seasons, Bayern has won 9 titles, and PSG has won 8. And most importantly, these titles were often secured with large points gaps, regularly exceeding 10 points. That indicates seasons that were less competitive at the top. But the story becomes even more interesting when we broaden the analysis to other major European leagues. According to the index, some leagues that are rarely mentioned in debates are actually more competitive than the Big 5. This is notably the case for the Netherlands, Portugal, and Turkey. In these leagues, several clubs are genuinely capable of winning the title, and more importantly, they do so with extremely small margins. On average, over recent seasons, the gap between first and second place is under 5 points. In practical terms, that means the title race is decided almost every year in the final match days, and every game and every dropped point truly matters. In other words, in those leagues, the championship is not just competitive in theory, it is competitive on the pitch. There is regular alternation between champions, narrow winning margins, and a level of overall balance among the top clubs that prevents long-term dominance. And that completely changes how we interpret the word competitive. Because in the end, it is not necessarily the most media-covered leagues or those with the highest technical level that provide the most suspense. And now that we have seen this, we can go even further. Comparing European leagues is already interesting, but what is even more interesting is looking at it on a global scale. to see, concretely, which league is the most competitive on the planet, and conversely, which one is the least contested. As for the most competitive league, we have to look at the Ghana Premier League, which ranks clearly first according to the index. And when you look at the numbers, it immediately makes sense. Over the last decade, 8 different clubs have won the title, and most importantly, none of them managed to win it 2 seasons in a row. The gaps in the standings are extremely small, and power regularly changes hands. On the other hand, according to the index, the least competitive league in the world is in Tajikistan. There, the dominance is absolute. FK Istiklal Dushanbe have won the last 10 league titles with an average gap of 12 points in a championship that only has 22 match days. And that's not all. In 2011, the club finished with a goal difference of plus 114, an almost unreal margin at that level. This dominance is also explained by a structural imbalance. The man who founded the club is the son of the country's president, and the total market value of Istiklal's squad alone exceeds that of all the other teams in the league combined. Rather favorable conditions for the club. But these rankings also reveal something crucial. Winning too much can become a problem for a league. This phenomenon is known in sports economics as the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis. The principle is simple. The more predictable a championship becomes, the less interest it generates, and the less interest there is, the smaller the audience. Smaller audiences mean lower revenues, and lower revenues weaken the entire competition. In other words, what gives a league its value is not only its level of play, but its uncertainty. And this can even be seen in the biggest leagues, particularly in France or Germany, where certain long periods of dominance have reduced the overall tension of seasons. When suspense disappears from the title race, collective attention gradually declines. The consequences are directly visible on the economic level. If we compare international TV rights, the money paid by foreign broadcasters, to our league, the gaps are enormous. Around 80 million euros per season for League One, roughly 240 million euros for the Bundesliga, more than 800 million euros for La Liga, and over 2.5 billion euros for the Premier League. In concrete terms, this means the English Championship generates more than 30 times the international revenue of France and more than 10 times that of Germany. And this difference is not only linked to the quality of players, it is directly tied to overall interest. An uncertain league attracts more viewers, more investment, and more sponsors. That money then allows clubs to attract better players, which further strengthens attractiveness. It becomes a virtuous cycle. Conversely, excessive dominance can trigger the opposite mechanism: less suspense, less interest, less value, and behind that, a weakened overall level. This is a criticism often directed at certain leagues, particularly League One during the PSG era, rightly or wrongly. But the argument has come up repeatedly in recent years. A league that is too predictable may struggle to prepare its clubs for European competition because domestic intensity is lower. Even supporters can eventually feel this effect. Recently, some Bayern fans admitted they were growing bored watching matches and were attending the Allianz Arena less frequently. And that is the paradox of football. In this sport, being too superior for too long can ultimately harm the product itself, because a completely predictable league does not become more impressive one. It simply becomes less captivating. But it's also important to understand one thing. A league's predictability does not only concern the title, it can exist at multiple levels. A league can be unpredictable in the title race, but completely fixed when it comes to European qualification spots. Conversely, it can have the same winner every year, but an incredible relegation battle. It can also be competitive because any team can beat any other, even without ever challenging for the title. And that is precisely where the limitation of our index appears. The LCI is a powerful tool to measure competitiveness, but only in one specific aspect: the title race and the level of dominance at the top of the table. It does not take into account the fight for European spots, the battle to avoid relegation, the financial power of clubs, international attractiveness, or even the overall depth of quality between teams. And that's important to highlight, because a good indicator is not one that claims to explain everything, but one that helps us better understand what we observe. In the end, what this analysis shows is that perception and reality are not always the same. Some leagues that seem dominated are actually very competitive. And conversely, some leagues perceived as open may be far more predictable than we imagine. The index we used is obviously not perfect, but it is an excellent starting point to analyze a league's competitiveness using concrete data rather than impressions. If you have another idea for an indicator or a different method to measure competitiveness, feel free to write it in the comments. And if you want me to calculate the competitiveness index for a specific league, mention it in the comments and I'll reply directly with the result. In any case, if you enjoyed the video, don't hesitate to like it, boost it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. And I'll see you very soon for a new video. Bye.